Okay, well, welcome everybody to the first webinar organised as part of the Migration for Inclusive African Growth, or MIAG project. My name is Giles Mohan and I'm MIAG's lead. This is the first of 3 webinars over the coming week where we want to discuss some of our work and sorry, just went into sleep mode. But also link it into wider context of other research, policy and action around migration and development. So today we're looking quite broadly across ways in which MIAG but our esteemed guests have also tried to link migration in its many forms to different framings of development and growth. And to that end, I'm delighted and honoured to have such wonderful speakers. I'm going to just briefly introduce them to you. So first up, we have Professor Crawley, who joined Coventry University in 2014. She leads MIAG, which I'm sure she'll talk to you about later, which is the world's largest migration research project, focusing on the relationships between migration, inequality and development. And she has about 30 years or more experience of working on migration and has published extensively on questions of asylum and migration. Dilip Rathe is the founder and head of Nomad and is lead economist at the World Bank in the Migration, Remittances, Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice. He's a thought leader on migration, remittances and innovative financing for development. He gave as an example of that, he gave the 2014 TED Talk, which has had about 1.5 million views, been very inspirational for many others in terms of starting up their own businesses. He was the founder of the Migrating Out of Poverty Research Program, which I know a number of people involved in MIAG were also involved in, and founder of the African Institute of Remittances. And Dilip's held various corporate and academic positions in India and beyond. So you're very welcome. And I think you're joining us relatively early in the morning, so thank you. Finally, Oliver Bakewell, who's a reader in migration studies at Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, or GDI. And his work focuses on the intersections between migration and mobility and processes of development and change, largely with an Africa focus. And prior to joining GDI, he was for about 10 years at the International Migration Institute at the University of Oxford. And he's been both a kind of researcher and practitioner, has worked obviously on university-based research projects, but also as a practitioner within development and humanitarian NGOs. So all very welcome. We're going to hear from everybody soon. I'm going to start by saying a few words about MIAG before inviting those panelists to speak, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Could you please post any Q&A into the chat function, and my colleague on MIAG, Craig, you're welcome, Craig, will kind of triage those and ping them to me so I can feel those in a kind of orderly manner. The session is being recorded and it will be available to view from next week. So if you follow the Twitter feed, you'll find a link to that should you want to watch it and share it. The event is being simultaneously translated into Portuguese by Flavia and Wagner, so thanks to them. So could speakers, and this is really a note to myself, speak clearly and slow, not too slowly, but relatively slowly, so that they have a chance to actually translate for us. If you're unsure how to switch languages on Zoom, there will be a link that tells you how to do that. So any Portuguese speakers who would rather listen in Portuguese, there is a link in the chat on how to do that. And finally, do tweet and tag us at internationaldev_OU. Again, that will appear in the magical chat box. And you can sign up for various newsletters and things. So thank you very much. So as I said, I want to just start by telling you a little bit to give some context around what MIAG is about and how we started it. It dates back to a period, the African Lions discourse was very potent around 2010. You had a global economic crisis, but on the back of essentially a lot of commodity-driven growth, mainly coming from China, a number of African countries were experiencing double-digit growth, Ghana and other countries. At the same time, we had the Eurozone crisis, the downturn in some of Europe's marginal economies, and we were kind of hearing anecdotal evidence that there was increased migration, largely economic migration, both to and within Africa. So what MIAG has sought to do is to sort of look at these so-called new migration flows, albeit that they build on older established trajectories, and look at what forms of growth they're bringing about in those African countries. And we've selected Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya and Mozambique, and we have partners from those countries here today. I want to formally thank them. It's been an interesting time trying to do a big research project across during COVID, but we've managed it, and delighted that we've got to this point. We were funded by the Global Challenge Research Fund, which I think we'll hear about possibly more today. I mean, what then is inclusive growth? I mean, I think it's migration scholars have long been thinking about what kind of more encompassing views of development can we think about that relates to development. I guess that's at the heart of what we want to talk about today. Inclusive growth has become a kind of a more popular concept within development policy, largely driven by some of the multilateral organizations like OECD and the Asian Development Bank. But I think it's not being used systematically in analysis, and it's not really been linked systematically either to migration. But the impetus for moving towards inclusive growth was the deficiencies of only focusing on economic growth, and the realization that for the previous 30 years or so, the growth that had occurred was largely generating greater inequalities, and therefore it has an analytical potential, but it's largely a very normative agenda. We want more inclusive growth rather than less, or we want less exclusive growth. And it's not without its problems conceptually. I'm not going to rehearse some of those. They will pop up, I think, at various points throughout the discussion. Inclusive growth is then much more about the quality of growth rather than growth per se. And most proponents, and some of the work that was done at the bank 10, 11 years ago, argued that it had to be long-term, broad-based, and covering multiple sectors. So we might see growth periods in a particular country linked to a spike in commodity demand and rising commodity prices, but that isn't necessarily inclusive unless it's sustained and that growth spreads into other areas of the economy. But inclusive growth is rather vague. If you look at OECD, they have this dashboard of what constitutes inclusive growth. You can just keep adding digital inclusive growth and green inclusive growth, and so you can get this very amorphous concept. So I think what we try to do is say, well, okay, there's some value here. How can we pin it down and apply it in our work, as opposed to trying to apply it in its totality. And we took on what was kind of the pro-poor plus argument, which is arguing that we need to focus on the poor as a target group and understand what happens during these growth episodes to the poor, but we don't just focus on the poor, we focus on wider development context, not least because growth in some parts of the economy may also affect the poor. So if we just I think crucially, there's a kind of political economy analysis of the nature of political power, and some of the work done at GDI under the ESID project with Sam Hickey and others, and Kunal Sen, was really about how you understand the relationship between inclusive growth and the kind of nature of the political systems in which that growth is occurring. So we've taken that on board. I think we wanted to say that inclusive growth isn't a kind of thing that you jump from A to B, and when you get to B, you've reached the kind of magic world of inclusive growth. It's much more of a process. So what we've tried to do in MIAG is understand the multifarious mechanisms that link both economic and non-economic growth to these well-being outcomes. And also the conditions for inclusive growth are very kind of context dependent. Some have used that to say, well, we can't have a general understanding of inclusive growth because it differs everywhere. So we end up with just like lots of little cases of what might be happening. We try to focus on a comparative methodology across 4 countries, but look at it at slightly finer grained scales. And I'll come on to that in a second. So you have this concept, you're then trying to work out how to apply it. Most of the people that have applied inclusive growth have looked at 2 indicators, so growth and inequality. So you can have growth, but if it leads to greater inequality, then it's not inclusive growth. Again, people like Kunal Sen and others have tracked that over time. There's been some studies which have then used much more composite quantitative indicators. So you have a number of inclusive growth areas of activity, and you then take indicators and create these composite indicators, track them over time. And that's largely been done at the national level, though there is some that's doing it at the urban scale and at the regional scale. And we have taken on board some of that sort of more quantitative approaches. But when it comes to looking at migration and inclusive growth, we tried to build on some of the work that Dilip's team pioneered 10 years or so ago, some of Shaze's work on understanding the relationship between migration and inclusive growth, and throwing down the challenge that the big problem is what's the causality that links migration to inclusive growth, and that's where we're trying to understand these mechanisms through which it occurs, rather than just say, well, there's these levels of migration and these outcomes in inclusive growth, and we infer there's some relationship. We've tried to understand what might be the causal links between those. Other areas we tried to innovate was, most of the migration and development research is focused on south to north migration flow, so emigration, and then look at the impacts on sending on the receiving households of those remittances. We wanted instead to focus on immigration because of that growth that we thought was taking place in Africa. We wanted to look at the migration flows into Africa, either within the continent or to the continent. So I think it'd be interesting to sort of hear what Heaven has to say. We also we looked at south-south migration flows, so that was either intracontinental, so between African countries, which is the dominant form of south-south migration in Africa, but also those newer migration flows, or albeit building on older trajectories. So we look mainly, as the table suggests, Chinese and Indian migrants in those 4 countries. So we looked at a range of and the other thing we looked at was the north to south flows. Anecdotally, we understood that some kind of more classic expats were increasing in number in Africa, but diaspora repats, as some people call them, and some returnees were moving to Africa, albeit maybe on a transnational basis, not permanently, but setting up businesses back in those countries. So we tried to look then at sort of south-south and north-south flows rather than south to north, and looking at the remittances that came back. So as such, we focused largely on migrant businesses as opposed to households. So we looked at these businesses as innovators, investors, employers, and largely the SME sector, but not entirely. And we also focus on the service sector for reasons that often these immigrants involved in the services sector, but the service sector was an area of growth for a number of African countries over the past 20 years, albeit COVID has stalled that to some extent. And that also meant then focusing not on the unskilled and displaced migrants, which is often what we look at when we think of studies of African migration, but looking at skilled migration within and to Africa. I haven't got time to discuss the methodology, but we combined sort of quants with some business surveys with migrant businesses and non-migrant businesses as a kind of control group. We did a lot of qualitative interviewing with various stakeholders, migrant business community stakeholders, officials, etc. Data was obviously affected by COVID-19. Building trust, for example, over the phone when you've never met people is quite difficult, but the teams were fantastic. We did manage, I was just saying before we joined to Heaven, it was kind of a panic moment about a year and a half ago, and I thought, oh my God, we're not going to get any data to collect it. We've managed and prevailed, and thanks to everybody for that. And also, obviously, COVID itself had an impact on the growth trajectories we were looking at. I'm very brief. I'm just going to finish with some very high level findings. We've got this massive data, which is great. We're still trying to make sense of it all. So these are necessarily kind of provisional and fairly high level. But in terms of when we looked at the kind of policy commitments in inclusive growth, most countries had some kind of understanding of inclusive growth in their big policy visions, the 2030s and 2050 kind of policy visions. Yet clearly the data showed, not surprisingly, that while there was often good progress in some indicators of inclusivity, certain groups tended to be less included, and often women and the youth were part of those groups. And again, I guess not surprisingly, the growth episodes were still linked largely to resource extraction and to commodity prices. So that Ghana showed a very good trajectory through the early 2000s, but that's kind of stalled as kind of oil prices fell away and the rest of it. So how far this growth is going to be sustained is questionable. We also talked to the various stakeholders about how they understood a kind of range of concepts around inclusive growth. And again, this is very broad brush, but national citizens they wanted jobs with these companies, so where they were seen as quite dynamic foreign firms, whether they were South African, Chinese, or whatever, but it was about getting those jobs and getting the income from that employment that was seen as key. But for the larger foreign firms, they tended to see themselves as contributing growth of the economy, tax revenue. That was seen as their role in that, what they understood by inclusive growth. Officials were interestingly much more focused on kind of capacity. It's around human capital and skills, and what those businesses could bring in terms of the capabilities for ongoing development within the countries concerned. And a number of the CSOs had more of the OECD's version. It was a very rounded contribution to well-being that they saw as being how they understood inclusive growth. And when we talked, and again, if colleagues want to jump in at some point in the Q&A, we've got lots of data, but the immigrant businesses, I mean, I think the picture very broadly was that you can't generalize. So there was both positive and negative competition, but this varied by sector. So, for example, in Ghana's construction sector, there was a lot of competition from Chinese, and that was seen as displacing employment of indigenous Ghanaian firms. But then when you talk to Ghanaian consumers, they'd say, well, we got, cheaper capital goods, it's good for us, we can afford to buy more. So to say Chinese migration was a good or a bad thing is very difficult to say. It varies depending on where you are within the economy and whether a consumer or producer. Ditto, the same with skills transfer. In some sectors we saw quite a lot of skills transfer, say around Indian IT, there was some interesting things going on there about transfer of skills, but in other sectors there was relatively little skills transfer. So there wasn't that building of wider capacity. Again, not surprisingly, across all respondents, there was an issue about access to credit. So these immigrant businesses often brought their own capital with them, whether from backers or their own savings or family, couldn't access local credit, which they said was an ongoing constraint to expanding those businesses. And a tension again between kind of what was seen as quite inclusive local content policies about localizing employment or creating, virtuous linkages into local supply chains. Those immigrant businesses felt that that was a barrier to them, expanding as well, which is understandable, but it's, and I think for policy a quite difficult task of, you want to encourage these immigrant businesses, but at the same time, how do you leverage those benefits for your own citizens? And there was all this talk about, well, you need to navigate these connections to get around and through some of the regulations. And there was a sense that this was worse for some groups than others. Nigerians consistently said that they had a bad deal compared to anybody else because they had a bad reputation. So they felt they had to work harder to get through those. In terms of diaspora engagement, we saw all countries except Mozambique. Mozambique does have a diaspora engagement program, but not a formal policy. There was an understanding that diaspora could bring entrepreneurship, but I think one of the things we need to drill in the data is questionable who benefits. I think a lot of those diaspora businesses seem to be serving other members of the diaspora who are essentially more middle class. So whether it's inclusive growth is open to question. And again, they talked about the difficulties of accessing credit and navigating kind of petty corruption and bureaucracy as constraints that they faced, despite having certain cultural affinities to those countries where they were operating. And finally, and webinar 3 next week, which is going to be hosted by Professor Tay at University of Ghana, we were looking at migration policy. So Ghana, Nigeria, they have migration policies. Kenya, they're not evenly implemented. Some ministries pick up on this, they build it into their strategic thinking and planning and their budgets. Other ministries totally ignore it. So in terms of kind of mainstreaming migration and development across government, it's very patchy, is the picture that we picked up. But clearly they're aware, that officials are aware that immigrants are a potential source of tax, but the immigrants themselves felt that these policies were really aimed at the big multinationals and not these SMEs, of which they were the overwhelming number. So I think there was a tension there between these SMEs needing to be registered and pay tax, but also not really able then to influence the policies which shape their ability to make a difference. And one of the things that comes through for the inclusive growth is it's about participation in the political and decision-making sectors that it defines inclusive growth as opposed to just growth. And I think there was this tension there that said we're contributing but we're not getting any voice. So yeah, I think that was, a very whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid, through some of our key findings. And as I said, we're going to be rolling those out over the next few months as we've got working papers and book proposals in. So we hope to share that more detail with you and do raise stuff in the Q&A. I will now stop sharing because I want to see everybody else's lovely faces. There we go. So we now have some time around, I think around 40 minutes to open this up for a roundtable discussion with our expert panel. We're going to run this as a sort of roundtable discussions. I've got a number of questions which I've shared with the colleagues, and then at the end, as I said, we'll probably have about half an hour for Q&A. So as things pop up, please do put them into the chat, and Craig will bring those all together, and we will endeavour to get through as many of the questions as we can. So welcome again to Dilip, Oliver and Heaven. What I really want to do for the next 40 minutes or so is to sort of, in a sense, I've told you a little bit about how we've tried to think about migration and development, a little bit about what inclusive growth means to us, how useful or not we've found it in trying to understand some of these things we're seeing. So I really want you to hear from you about your own experiences of doing that, whether, and we obviously heard about MIAG at Coventry, but wealth of experience across and around the table. So I really want to ask, first of all, a set of questions around how you understand broadly migration and development. Is development a useful concept? Have you thought about whether, and if not, what have you been using? And then something around how far we think inclusive growth is a helpful concept, and then how you've taken the concepts that you've used and operationalize them in terms of research design and methods. And if we have any more time, we may want to move on to some questions around policy, but it's a big ask in 40 minutes, so I'm not going to push that one. So yeah, I'm gonna kick off then, if that's okay. Start with Heaven. I mean, how in your work have you tried to think about the relationship between migration and development?
Thanks, Giles, and yeah, it's good to be here and to hear a bit more about MIAG actually. But I'd also like to if I may, take a few minutes to tell you a bit about MIAG, because I don't think that everybody knows necessarily what MIAG is.
Far away.
We actually have a very long title, which is why we have, unfortunately, another M acronym. MIAG stands for Migration for Development and Equality, and I suppose it kind of captures what we see as being the relationship in a sense, which is that we see that migration has the potential to contribute towards development, but also towards equality. And so at the heart of the way in which we're looking at these issues is this relationship, not just between migration and development, but rather between migration and inequalities and equality in the context of development, because there's no necessary linear or simple relationship between migration and development, as we know, and as you've talked about. So our focus of our work in MIAG is really specifically on South-South migration. And we do that through the kind of construct of a migration corridor that's used by others, including Dilip, I know, because what we're interested in is not just the impact or the consequences of migration in the countries to which migrants go, but also the two-way flows, the relationships between countries of origin, if you like, and countries of destination, because I'm sure we'll hear more from Dilip about remittances, for example, but those flows are more than just remittances. They're flows of knowledge, ideas, relationships, interactions, culture, music. There are multiple different ways in which these flows take place. So the countries that we've chosen are really designed to try and kind of open up and unpack, indeed, this concept of South-South migration, which is, of course, incredibly diverse and multifarious. It's certainly not a singular concept, and to try and better understand these processes through a number of different thematic strands in particular. Our work is also funded by GCRF. As you'll know, GCRF has had a lot of struggles this year because of the reduction in ODA, and we're waiting to see what happens next. So in addition to COVID, we've also been dealing this year with a 70% cut, which has obviously seriously impacted upon our work, but fortunately most of our work is in the Global South, where our partners are based, and they're doing a really good job of collecting the data. And I think what that data is showing us very clearly is that migration, as we know, is embedded in the context in which it takes place, in the social context, the political context, the economic context, and the relationships between those different dimensions. And so to look at migration, I mean, I would argue, and as as somebody who works in migration, this might seem a little odd, but I would say that the biggest problem with migration research is that it focuses on migration, because migration is really just a consequence often of other things, including inequalities. So we're really interested in how inequalities drive migration potentially, but also how migration can itself help to reduce inequalities. So, for example, we know that migration can reduce inequalities and contribute to development through remittances, through the exchange of opportunities for education, the transfer of other things. But it can also increase inequalities by, for example, accelerating those differences within communities. For example, our research is showing that within southern Ethiopia, the remittance transfers back are actually creating inequalities in the region where most migrants come from. Some communities, some families can access healthcare, education, employment opportunities, businesses that others can't. And so there's inequalities being generated or reinforced in countries of origin, as well as the countries to which migrants travel. So I think it's really important, firstly, to situate or put inequalities at the heart of the discussion, not migration, because inequalities are linked to all sorts of broader structural processes. They're not simply linked to the movement itself. And then to try and unpack the kind of complex dynamics of that in these different contexts, because they are, as you've already alluded to, really very different because of the histories, because of the ongoing relationships, and because of the kind of, we have the, if you like, the kind of core and periphery of North and South, but we also have cores and peripheries within the South, within the North, and indeed within both sets of countries. So I hope that sort of starts to answer your question, but at least puts inequalities on the table very substantively, which is our objective. Thank you. Fantastic.
Thank you, Heaven. I mean, yeah, I think really important, I think, to look at that relationship between how inequality drives the migration and then reciprocally what migration means for inequality. I think probably all in different ways we're trying to do something like that. And yeah, very provocative to say, let's forget about migration in a sense. But we're here to discuss migration, so I'll put it back on the agenda. So Dilip, I mean, as I said, a lot of our work was inspired by the work that your team were doing 10 years ago or so. Give you a chance now to sort of elaborate a little bit on where you and the bank are thinking about migration and development at the moment. And clearly, as Heaven alluded to, you've done some fantastic work on remittances, but obviously, yeah, if you'd like to reflect a little bit about where you're at on that.
Thanks a lot. I guess I can call you Mohan, is it, or man? Is it? I don't know how to
yeah.
It's great to see Heaven and Oliver in the panel. Oliver and I worked on the Migrating Out of Poverty Consortium but a long time ago now. And just to put things in perspective, I think migration is integral to development. It's integral in the sense that these two are not separable. So there is no such thing as migration and, I mean, they are not two different concepts. And it's for the simple reason that if by development we mean somebody doing or some place doing better than other people or other places, there would be mobility. And by the way, that goes the other way around too. If somebody is doing worse or some place is doing worse than other people or other places, there'll be also movement appropriately. So migration is integral to development. And if we don't allow that process to work, that people are able to move, then some people are getting hurt in a big way. And the community as a whole is hurt also in a big way, but we don't know by how much. And because we have not successfully estimated that and conveyed that and communicated that, we have all sorts of problems about migration, in terms of policy making. And related to that is a really big question that we have not been able to address either as a research community or in the World Bank, which is even more difficult as an international organization, development organization. And that question is about this whole issue of the social contract between the nation states and the people. If a country suddenly has a lot of migrants and the population increases, the share of the new people, foreign-born people, foreign people. If that exceeds half of the population, in a democracy, they would have the power, right? So who does the nation belong to? Who does the nation state belong to? Or this whole question of nation and state being connected, are they really connected or should they not be connected anymore? We have world peace for a while now, so-called peace, because we have kind of stuck to the nation state concept. Should it be that way? Especially with the climate change going the way it is. Okay, I pushed the agenda a little too far, too high up, but coming down to the basic point about migration and development, as Heaven pointed out, you all have pointed out already, Mohan, you too did that. One tangible link is remittances, but then there are other links like trade, tourism, investment, skill transfers, technology transfers, philanthropy, and then impacts on values. And of all of them, and I say that with having searched for tangible things about all other things, but I have not found a lot other than anecdotes. The only things on which you have tangible things, and that's why you can actually put your hand around it and do some research, is remittances and investments, diaspora investments. Even the diaspora investment part is not very clear. And the role of, let's say, the Chinese diaspora in China's development, Korean diaspora in Korea's development, Indian diaspora in India's development is a bit iffy. So remittances, big story now. They were resilient during the crisis, way more resilient than we expected. And they are recovering this year. And we will have a report out. As of now, the plan is to release the new data and report on November 17, but we'll see. Now, big news is that remittances are no longer small change. Since 2015, if you excluded China from the group of low and middle income countries, remittances are now larger than both official development assistance, official aid, and foreign direct investment that goes through all the multinational companies together. Meaning remittances are larger than both ODA and FDI together. If you look at the trajectory, remittances have no, they will continue to increase for the medium term at least, or maybe for the long term. You can't say that about the other flows. So that's one fact. The other thing is, again, Heaven alluded to that, South-South migration is larger than South-North migration. And in Africa, 70% of the cross-border migration is within Africa. And the developmental links, particularly through remittance, but even otherwise, are actually broken in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So you have the migration, South-South migration, intra-regional migration, very, very significant in terms of size and in its importance to the economies and to households, to people. But the developmental links are actually fragmented, disrupted, ruptured because of policy. And there should be many low-hanging fruits there to harvest. So those are sort of two key messages I wanted to point out. And the third thing I wanted to point out is that there has been a tendency so far to sort of say that, hey, the drivers of migration, some people use the word root causes, which is not the right thing to say because root causes are for bad things. Migration is not a bad thing. Migration is endemic to our lives. So it's not, it's not a bad thing. I mean, it's not in the sense of pandemic. No, it's integral to us. So people say that root causes of migration, the fundamental drivers of migration, poverty, inequality, unemployment, all the bad things, that's a developing country problem. And the rich country problem is, integrating all these people and trying to keep the flows to minimal so that the social contract between the state and the people in the rich countries is not somehow undermined. That dichotomy is failing. The dichotomy, I mean, recently you had the truck driver issues in UK, the whole supply chain issue globally. It has a lot to do with migrants and migratory flows, and I think both rich countries as senders of migrants and recipients of migrants is very much true. The same way for poor countries, I think the issue of integrating immigration or dealing with challenges posed to native-born workers by foreign-born workers is very, very tangible as well. So truly, migration is a global development issue. It's not a development issue for the developing countries, if that is a politically correct word, that is. So let me stop there, and then we can pick up other later if you have questions.
Thank you, Dilip. I've got lots of questions. I mean, I think interesting, this question about the tangible and intangible flows that we can look at. And I guess there's some interesting questions about how can we get into the intangibles in a meaningful way, and what's the link between the intangible and the tangible. But we'll come on to that. And yeah, I think that last point of yours is something we've been trying to deal with in MIAG, is all the literature about integration is largely around Europe, and we were trying to say, well, if you turn that lens, say a Nigerian in Ghana or a South African or a Botswanan in Mozambique, well, there's similar issues around integration, and that affects their ability to contribute and to become included in those societies. So I've got tons of things I'd love to talk to you about that, but I'm going to give Oliver a chance to chip in on his kind of take on, how he understands very broadly the relationship between migration and development, but then also conceptually how have you tried to sort of make that meaningful in your own work?
Great, thanks. Coming third, a lot of things I might have said have already been said, but I've come into this from a background of doing a lot of work on different aspects of migration, primarily looking at movements within Africa. So. And I take that from the perspective, to some extent, my viewpoint is the movement within Africa it's another continent like all the others, and there's not necessarily such a huge difference. So rather than looking at African migration as a special thing, it's like many things about the movement, like these questions of integration, there's fascinating things going on where the majority of people, migrants from Africa, move to other parts of the continent. There's virtually no integration policies across the continent, but people settle and become parts of new societies. And that, I think, raises some interesting questions, which we can then reflect. So learning from what's going on in movement in Africa, I think, casts a lens for how we can maybe understand movements in other parts of the world. But I come to this from a background of development studies, so I've sort of been fascinated by this relationship between migration and development. So going to that question, from my perspective, they are fundamentally intertwined. Without migration and mobility, there is going to be no change and development. But at the same time, development, social change will affect the way people move. The two things are completely intertwined. I do tend to see migration and mobility perhaps as more fundamental. It's just such a basic part of human life. And you can talk to the demographers, and one of the confusing things to them is people are born, then they move around the world, and then they die somewhere else. And that's it's what we do as human beings. And I think one thing over the last 18 months of COVID, where across the world we've seen these huge restrictions on our day-to-day mobility and our possibilities of moving and migrating, is how important mobility is to human flourishing. So in that sense, I think migration is so much fundamental part of the way we flourish, and that is part of my understanding of development. I say the trouble with much of our analysis of development, in perspective of coming from it as from development studies, is it pays far too little attention to people's movement. We've conceptualized development in rather static ways. We are thinking about states, the development of states. And as Dilip was suggesting, when a lot of people move to a new place, it raises all sorts of questions. What does the state look like now? What is the nation? How do we measure the success, the change in development of that place? if people are coming and going from it. So states or geographical regions as containers of development, I think maybe is quite problematic. And we have very limited ways of understanding what we mean by development when people move around. I think migration, in that way, migration does introduce huge challenges to our thinking. It's, as Dilip has pointed out, it does raise questions about our politics, our economics and social structures. And while I agree with Heaven that actually we need to move a lot of the focus away from migration, because it's, again, as both Dilip and Heaven suggest, it's often seen as a problem to be sort of managed and addressed. I think in terms of policy and practice, moving that focus will probably be very helpful. But as analysts, I think we still have a lot more work to do in terms of understanding how migration filters through into the way we conceptualize the world, conceptualize processes like development. And so it's trying to understand, so rather than focusing on migration as something to be tackled, it's an underlying process, it's there. And how do we bring that into analysis of the things, the politics, the sociology, the economics of the world that we see around us? I'll stop there.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, that last point, I think a number of you have been sort of moving around that question of states as containers and how useful they are as kind of analytical categories. Or, I mean, coming back to you, Heaven, I mean, you talked about corridors as a kind of way of understanding that in maybe in slightly different, I'm a geographer, so I'm going to use the word spatial. I mean, is it a different spatial register, if you like, for understanding that? Is that why you chose to look at corridors? Or was that coming back to Dilip's point? It was at least a tangible thing you could look into and look at flows backwards and forwards along a corridor.
Well, and I guess the main reason for using corridors, and we're not the first people to use it at all. I mean, plenty of people have used this as a kind of a framing device, if you like, because that's all it is. And there is not a singular corridor between country A and country B. There are multiple corridors going off in all sorts of different directions. But I think why it's helpful is it really draws attention to the sort of interrelational nature of migration, because as both Dilip and Oliver have said, I mean, yes, there's much that we could and need to know about migration itself, but it's ultimately embedded in context, and those contexts are incredibly different. And what happens at different ends of the corridors also is very different. So you can't presuppose that even if you had forms of movement, forms of experience of migration that are similar, the consequences will be different because they're embedded in entirely different contexts. And as Oliver and Dilip have also alluded to, those contexts are increasingly political. And the problem with that politicization is that, I've argued this for a long time, migration is often a touchstone issue to deal with, to sort of a reference point for dealing with these other issues. So, the anxieties that citizens or others have about security, have about zero-hour contracts, have about, their place in the world, in a world that's become very different over the last 30 years to the ones that their parents and grandparents were familiar with. These are all understandable sort of uncertainties and insecurities. Throw COVID into the mix, throw Brexit, throw whatever you like. Those uncertainties are understandable, and those insecurities. Unfortunately, what politicians have done, as we know, is to sort of, use the migration issue to sort of explain away the government responses or failures of responses to it. So I think I'm also a geographer, so I think the spatialization of this is critically important. And, we mustn't sort of, reduce the South to being singular in its experience, or Africa. I mean, we're talking a continent that's as big as 4 of the main continents on the planet. The complexity and the diversity of that migration is huge, absolutely huge. And only by understanding that diversity, I think, can we really get to what's going on. And the problem with the policies, of course, is they almost always are quite similar. Even in Africa now, you have quite similar policies to those that we've seen in the global north over recent years. So I think it's really a point, about that interrelationship between migration and the spatial context, but how that's being flattened out, if you like, by the political debate, and how the inequalities underpinning it are also being flattened out because people aren't talking about them. They're only talking about the kind of physical manifestation of those inequalities, which is in many cases the movement of people. If we were to talk about the inequalities that underpin that, we'd have a very different conversation. And part of that conversation would be how global capitalism is working and how it's exploiting both within the periphery and outside to its own advantage. With the consequences for the human beings that are involved. So I think a conversation about inequalities takes us to a very different place in terms of how we think about this conceptually, but also politically. I'll stop there.
Thank you, fantastic. I mean, Dilip, you talked earlier, I mean, in terms of if we have got this kind of, as Heaven alluded to there, you know, increasingly sort of footloose capital gouging out kind of value wherever it can. I mean, what, and then you also talked about the kind of possibly the, not irrelevance, but the kind of potential irrelevance of the nation state. I mean, how then do policy actors, activists, whoever, try to, I don't like the word manage, but how do you then respond to that? If you're saying the nation state isn't necessarily the best container for that, these processes transcend the state and state policies are all looking a bit samey, where then is the kind of locus for our political activity? Where should it be, or multiple sites should it be?
I think I raised that issue of the, you know, the need to the sense of building in some fluidity to the concept of nation state. I think is needed, and it is not being talked about at all. But it's a bit like climate change. You can't address climate change unless you accept that, you know, the wind will flow and heat will rise and wildfires will spread without worries about national boundaries, right? Mm-hmm. National boundaries are lines in the sand that we have drawn, and, you know, winds of change will blow them away. We know that, right? So, but that is not being talked about. That is why we have the conflict constantly, and that's why it seems like us versus them and all sorts of issues. So it becomes very difficult, and I think I know by raising that issue, I make the whole issue very intractable. So, you know, then we kind of do what we are more able to do, which is focus on a few issues, bring the whole challenge down to a few tractable issues, and then try to sort them out. So go kind of more the bottoms up way rather than the top down way. I don't know if that makes sense. So specific interventions in the specific places, contextualize the problem and say, here are 3 priorities that need to be addressed. So that's the way we are proceeding, and maybe that's the right way to do it. So there is a question, do we want to, you know, some group of people, and that's where, you know, your group and Haven's group and all these groups, they come in. You all could address specific issues, or you go to the bigger issues and then also do the bigger issues. And I think we should not lose track of that. That's my only and most important submission. Below that level, at a more tractable level, what can we do? And, you know, on facilitating remittances, we can do a few things, very easy to do. But then we get into the whole issue of, you know, the homeland security type or interior affairs ministries of every country in the world, So I'm not saying it is only UK or US, it is also India and Nigeria and Mexico, everywhere in the world. The Interior Ministry and the Treasury Ministry and the Development Ministry don't get along. I mean, you know, and that's why they are there as separate entities. So that tussle is there. I feel it very much in my work on a day-to-day basis. So even small things like, you know, introducing fintech and recognizing that small remittances are not money laundering is very difficult. You have this problem that, you know, you send money to Cuba and you are worried about the military benefiting from that. And then you are worried about money flowing to Afghanistan, and you are worried about helping the people there because otherwise they will migrate. But then you want to help the military there because they will fight the Taliban, right? So great. I mean, we have that kind of low-hanging fruits that cannot be plucked because we are bogged down, tied down on the ground. We cannot even raise our hands. That is one. The other sort of broad brush message that is dawning on me more recently is that we have been thinking about addressing root causes of migration by creating employment, reduce poverty, all the good things. And that's a win-win. Of course, we should reduce poverty. Of course, we should share prosperity. And migration is the best way of sharing prosperity. Absolutely the best way. So I had a meeting with a World Bank president once, and he asked, so what can we do about reducing poverty? And I said, how fast do you want to do it? And I said, you want to reduce world poverty in 1 year? Open up the borders. You will see. Just open up the borders all over the world. US alone, which is not the largest country in the world, has more land area than India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, plus a few other countries. So what are we talking about? So it's more about that identity question. So more recently, what has dawned on me is that we cannot really address root causes of we should address root causes of migration, but we cannot hope that that would stop migration. There is no way. Demographic change, somewhere around 300 million people will join the working age population in Africa alone in the next 20 years or so. I mean, how can you generate jobs for them? And if income inequality, per capita income differences between Africa and Europe is 1 to 54 or 1 to 36, which is the actual number, why would a person who is earning $1 in Nigeria or in Malawi or in Senegal not want to migrate to a country in Europe or in the US and earn $36, right? And on top of that, throw in the issue of security. So addressing root causes will help slow the flow, but they will not slow the flow. And I am kind of beginning to think that they will slow the flow by maybe 10%, if at all. 90% will keep coming. 90% will keep coming. Like the Walking Dead movie or the TV series, they will keep coming in a good way, in a good way. They're not zombies, these are human beings. They're my fathers and mothers and sisters. So what will I do then? Shoot them? No. I think the policy message has to shift from addressing root causes to putting up with migration. Means that we need to move away from keeping this issue in the South and say, let's look at South-South migration. Let's look at only addressing the problems there, to sort of look at ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, what can we do to live with migration? I think we need to do that.
Thank you, Dilip. I had a question or comment from one of the MIAG researchers, Parvati Raghuram, who is also based at the Open University. And sort of to put this to Oliver and knowing some of his work, but I mean, Parvati says that the question of the nation state is particularly, I mean, you said that you didn't think African migration was not particularly special, in the sense it's similar things are going on around the world, and to single out African migration as somehow unique is possibly risky. I mean, Parvati says that the question of the nation state is particularly important in Africa, where the nation is not equivalent to the state. It's also important in the case of insurgent and resurgent nationalism today. I mean, do you not think that there's something in the kind of colonial and post-colonial relationship between the state and nation in Africa that is peculiar, or do you think it's part and parcel of a kind of wider issue that kind of Dilip raises about the disconnect between nations and states anyway in the social contract?
I think it's distinctive in different parts, but there's the same issues. I mean, I point out to students when I teach about sort of African borders, the map of Africa today is nearly identical to the one I was born with. The map of Europe today looks completely different. We've seen this across Europe. The borders are shifting. Now, of course, the origins of the borders in Africa, there's a particular history there. And yeah, the tying up of the state and nations, but what those mean, every case is different. There's, yeah, I wouldn't attempt to go into the histories that have given rise to the identities of the different peoples, and yeah. But I think you could look at a similar, there's parallels in other parts of the world. Borders are always artificial.
Mm.
And this idea that African borders are somehow more artificial, maybe originally they were, but then you look at how long they have been in place as quite fixed. Well, yeah, I'm not sure that necessarily holds. So there is a huge problem of inserting the different nationalisms across the continent, as we also see in other parts of the world. I'm not denying that, but I'm always a bit resistant to this idea of African borders are somehow a bit different and weaker, and they have less meaning. I think the work I did on the Angola-Zambia border many years ago, and what really struck me there was how quickly people were telling me about how they incorporated this line drawn by an alien administration into their lives, knowing that if you cross this stream, you would then be in Portuguese or British territory, and that would give you some benefits, some costs. And they incorporate that into that. And I think that's, people play with borders around them, and yeah, they incorporate it into the way people live in very different ways in different contexts. So how, when I'm talking about migration across Africa, it's not the state doesn't matter, it does, and the borders do matter. People are crossing them, and they're crossing them in ways which aren't necessarily regulated by states. That doesn't mean they're not regulated, but states don't necessarily have the laws in place, the policies, but people still move, and it's accepted. There's a social conventions, which local conventions, which enable that to happen, and to happen peacefully, and to go on. So the question then is how far those sorts of movements need to be incorporated into the structures of nation states in terms of policies, which then, and Heaven's exactly right, you do see the same policies being reproduced across the continent, it seems. And maybe that's one of the worrying things for me about the whole migration and development discussion, is that those of us concerned with development in terms of improving the qualities people live have bought into this idea of migration is somehow important for this. And I think a lot of the interest pushing the discussion about migration development is from people who are, or interests who are very much concerned about migration. And I think that creates problems. So you've got this ideas of how migration should be managed, made policy around it to contribute to development. And I often think that's maybe a bit of an irrelevance sometimes for how each countries develop. I'm not sure that.
I mean, so Parvati's comment on your response was agreed. Very good points, thank you. But also, I just wondering, I mean, is policy then an attempt to kind of almost become I mean, I've noticed as well across our MIAG research that a lot of the policies are the same, and people that are involved in drafting policies in one African country seem to move across and then help draft the policies, and they draw on IOM kind of templates a little bit. Yeah. I mean, so is that policy making then, given what we've just been discussing, is that an attempt to kind of almost like perform the state and kind of, in a sense, it's like, well, we can manage this stuff. Look, we've got a policy that tries to do it, knowing full well that actually you can't. I mean, from what you said, integration happens despite of not having an integration policy. So is the policy a performative kind of act of trying to prove your nation stateness, even at the same time as it's being kind of undermined by those flows?
I mean, I don't think I've got the evidence for this, but an argument that I would, I think it's worth exploring is how far the policies are, they're performative for an audience outside the country, and it generates reward. There's a whole sort of set of incentives to develop policies which look good internationally. I often have great doubts about how far many large parts of the state actually buy into that and buy into those concerns and interests, because there's so many other interests in migration about business interests, about people moving back and forth, labor, people need the labor, the trade. And if you try to follow too much of the policy, especially when you're talking about the borders, which are, we're not talking about airports, we're talking about the land borders. It's like the resources you'd need to make it look like European well-managed migration. It's like, come on, we could do something better with development money than invest in that. That's my perspective. So it's a sense of, there's a performance, and part of the problem, I think, is that migration has been built into the development discussion, and I'm not sure in a very positive and constructive way.
Do you want to add anything to that, Heaven? I saw you nod a little bit there. We've got some questions for Dilip and Heaven, but do you want to say anything, Heaven, on that point before I kind of introduce some of the questions?
No, I was just nodding. That's fine.
Okay, very good. It was the nod was noted.
Nothing extra.
Very good.
I was agreeing.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll a question that's come in for you, Heaven, from a colleague, Ramos in Maputo, is Professor Crawley said something that is also observed in some emigration communities in southern Mozambique, which is the inequality created by remittances in these communities. And he says this will prevail whenever there are some families migrating and others not. And he says, from a policy point of view, is there a way to prevent this from happening? So, yeah.
It's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one to answer, I think. The case I was referring to was with our colleagues in Ethiopia who are doing work in southern Ethiopia, where the remittances from southern Ethiopia to South Africa, where the remittances are really quite high, even in the context of COVID, they've maintained themselves, as Dilip was saying. But I think it's very difficult to know what the kind of response to that should be, because an instinct might be to say, well, then people shouldn't be allowed to migrate because you're creating inequalities. But that fails to observe take note of the really important point, which is that it's the better off people that migrate in the first place. I mean, we know from almost every context where we work in that where people are living in extreme poverty with no resources, those are not the people who are able to move. In fact, the point that Dilip was making, that if you reduce poverty, if you increase opportunity, we know that there's a migration hump, that people were, certainly in the first instance, will move because they then have the resources to do so. So it's not as if those inequalities, in fact, none of the inequalities that we see in our research in MIAG are newly created by migration. What migration is doing is kind of often reinforcing or deepening some of these existing inequalities. So without remittances, you would still have those inequalities, I suppose. The question then is, I suppose, how can you, or even should you, I suppose, support the possibility of distribution of resources within a community? So, for example, home associations are one way in which people try to do that, for diasporas kind of contributing to things that are more community-led or community-driven within a context. And that often is the case. But I think it's also really important in the context of inequality that we don't think somehow that inequalities are particular or specific to the global south. I mean, I think we can safely say that there are plenty of inequalities in the global north too. And as much wealth as you might have in a context, it almost seems that inequalities are deepened everywhere, right? You look at the vast inequalities in wealth in a country like the UK. This is not, it doesn't mean that with so-called development, you get reduced inequalities. So I think it's a great question. I think it's one which our Ethiopian colleagues are currently kind of struggling with or grappling with, as to know, what the kind of implications of that are. But I also think, and I guess this harks back a little bit to Oliver's point, that it's not that there has to be a policy solution for everything. There is a tendency, particularly in migration, I think, to think we need policies for everything. And a lot of the problems that are created in the migration world are caused by policies. We know that, in terms of preventing people from moving across borders, returning, people become trapped, the fact that they're not able to, do what they would choose to do. They have to kind of be constrained within these policy frameworks that are often very artificial, and as others have said, designed as much, I think, to appeal to an internal audience as much as an external one. So I think it's a great question. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I don't know that necessarily we need always to have a policy answer, and that people actually find their own ways sometimes of addressing these issues within particular contexts. So thanks for the question.
Fantastic, thank you. Got some questions coming in. So this next one is aimed at Dilip, but it's from Anonymous, so I can't tell you who he or she is. So they're reflecting on a comment you made, Dilip, about north-south, that we tend to focus on particular north-south or south-south migration flows. And you also mentioned this issue about, you know, focusing on tangible benefits because in a sense they're easier to find than intangible ones. But in terms of the tangible benefits, the question is, can you reflect from a methodological perspective on how to go about researching or investigating this comparison between the north-south and south-south flows? I guess the question might be, are there distinctive methodologies for looking at different types of flows, or yeah? Oh, hello.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. Yeah, I was thinking about this question when I saw it, and I remembered that in a series of reports we published for, we called it Africa Migration Report, or reports. So there was one called Leveraging Migration for Development in Africa. I think that was with African Development Bank, 2011, I think we published that. We conducted 6 surveys in Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, I think, and there may have been Burkina Faso as well. And from those surveys, what we found out was that remittances coming from the north to, let's say, Nigeria are sizable, but then also remittances coming from the south, meaning from other countries, other parts of Africa to Nigeria. And by the way, some remittances might be coming from other regions in the developing world as well. So that was also significant, but on average, remittances from the north, so-called north, that means high-income OECD countries, was about 4 times the average size of remittances coming from the poorer countries. And then there is an interesting question. In dollar terms, yes, the values are higher, but in terms of impact on poverty, which one is better? And I kind of think that south-south migration might have a deeper impact on poverty reduction. That the very poor people, this is the point that the migration hump kind of thing that Heaven was mentioning as well. Very poor people can't move very far away, but they do move to either the cities or to across the border. And that might have a huge poverty reduction impact, perhaps deeper. It hasn't been studied, and it would be easy to do that. It would be very easy to do that if you had household survey data with enough observations. And that then leads me to another interesting thought about inequality. I don't know if I can, it is not fully formed in my head, but I was just thinking through this process. The way I see migration, okay, and before I go to that, there is another observation. This was from Sri Lanka household survey analysis that I had done with another colleague, where I found that the poorest don't migrate, the richest don't migrate, and I think the second, third, fourth quintile of the population, they migrate and they send back remittances. And in fact, they reduce inequality overall. So that's because you have to do the counterfactual analysis, and this is about the methodology. There is a question of the counterfactual. If the person had not migrated, what would the person have earned? That has to be there, that in the analysis, because the person migrates, sends money home or not. But if the person had not migrated, the person would have earned something. And we need to incorporate that into our analysis. So in that sense, there are two counterfactuals. One is whether the person migrates or not. Second, if the person migrates, whether the person sends money home or not. And in the case of the rich people, there is no reason for them to migrate because they are more at home than going abroad, right? I think about the billionaires in India or anywhere in the world. They don't want to migrate because they make more money at home, right? So that is a methodological point that ought to be built in, but it should be possible to do that in the context of South-South versus South-North migration, and perhaps even internal migration. I wouldn't be surprised if internal migration has more poverty reduction impact. And there is a question of life and death, literally. I mean, if people didn't migrate, they would die. So somehow bringing that into the analysis would be very useful.
Thank you, Dilip. So obviously people feel free to post any further questions. I was just one of the comments that was made in the previous response from Heaven was around in a sense the pooling of remittances, in the sense that if the question is that intra-household remittances might enhance inequality, they may not, or they may reduce inequality. That's one thing. But is there any evidence that people have from any of their research around, Heaven alluded to hometown associations as one way of kind of socializing remittance flows, is you do it on a community basis or a ethnically kind of group basis. And I know Dilip has done some work on various forms of financing. I mean, is there evidence that more socialized forms of remittance sending, whether it's diaspora bonds or these kind of things, make a difference in terms of questions of inequality?
Elaborate the point a little. I suppose there's a couple of points, particularly from that Ethiopian example, which obviously is not my research and it's not yet completed, but I think it's really interesting what they're finding. And I think there's a couple of things. First of all, in that context, the role of the church is critically important, and I think that's also the case in many other contexts, that the church provides, or the religious association of whatever kind it might be, provides a very important mechanism for both the transfer of resources, but also the redistribution in some cases of those resources. And then the other thing is that, yes, you may end up with increased inequalities because some households have more money than others, but those households are, for the most part, spending it on things in the community, and in so doing, generating other kinds of jobs, other kinds of opportunities by virtue of their investment in that community. So, it's a quite complicated picture, and it's not just the case that you just have lots of richer people in a community because they have a migrant sending back remittances and they're sort of then isolated from the community in which they live. I think that does, and I'm always really reluctant to use the word trickle down for all sorts of obvious reasons, but I think those resources do kind of become distributed in the community through various mechanisms, whether it's consumption or it's through church and other social interactions. So I think it's a really complex picture. And I certainly wouldn't want the policy response to be that they should sort of, for all the reasons that Dilip said about the value of remittances in terms of, worth more than ODA and RDI, you certainly wouldn't want to present them. In fact, you want to make them more easily transferable rather than the opposite. So anyway, just a point of clarification, really.
Okay, thank you. And another provocation from Parvati just came in. I mean, obviously we have stuff going on in Glasgow at the moment, COP26, where potentially there's discussions about degrowth and what are then the relationships between kind of understandings of degrowth, climate change, and migration, I think is the question. Does anybody fancy having a crack at that?
That's a challenging one.
Yeah. Oh. While people think about that one, if they can, Joseph, Professor Tay, who I think everybody knows in different contexts. Hi, Joseph. He's asked Dilip a question. Can you throw more light on the gender dynamics of remittances and poverty reduction? And I guess Dilip can answer that. Others may have some insights as well, but I'll start with you, Dilip.
Thanks. I think Ollie was going to respond to something. Or was it? No.
I was just trying to think about this climate change one.
Yeah, no, we'll come back to that one.
Yeah. On the gender, we did a survey of diaspora of Senegal, Nigeria, could be Mali as well. I know that there were at least three, two. I believe we did 3 diaspora groups from Africa, surveys of that in Belgium, small country, and it was in collaboration with the government. And we were told that, and by the way, that was, I think I used that to report that in 2005, 2006 in the Global Economic Prospects report on remittances and migration. We were told by the government that they had a very good population registry and they knew the addresses of all the migrants. So when we did the survey, the first thing was to notice that, and this points a little bit to methodological issues, most of the migrants were not at the address that they were supposed to be in. And so we couldn't do a proper sampling. So we had to go for snowballing. So you find the first one and then kind of hope that you will, and of course that leads to, similar people and, people in groups and including church groups that you survey. So report gets, the final findings get biased in that sense. But the other interesting finding from that was, and maybe the most interesting finding pertaining to the gender dimension, was that at that time we used to think that the head of the household sends money home, and often you think it is a man. But what we realized was that if there is a man and a woman in the family or an adult child, all of them send money home to their country and to different people and use different channels altogether. So that was an interesting point. The second interesting point was that men seemed like this, it was still anecdotal at that time, they tended to search for cheaper channels and all that, and then women were sending money through one money transfer company, which was much more known and convenient and dependable. The cost of sending money for that channel was higher, but the amount sent was lower. We never found out the benefit on the other side. The conventional view is that women tend to be more responsible senders of remittances. And on the other side, if women receive the money that is spent properly, that seems like that's a kind of a, is it an urban legend or a rural legend? I don't know, one of them. I haven't seen any good studies on that. In general, on migration and gender issues, there isn't a strong literature. In the Migrating Out of Poverty Consortium, we did try to do some work. It didn't work out very well. Nomad has done a paper on that. And one surprising finding to me was that in MENA region, less women were migrating than in other regions of the world, which I haven't figured out what was going on there and what has happened more recently. The data are becoming even more difficult to get. So there is that thing. Just to say, in the end, that the gender dimension of migration is not well understood. And the remittance behavior is a lot of cliches. It's not clear that we really have good findings on that. And any work we can do at the community level to throw light on that would be very, very useful.
Charles, can I just come in on that?
Yeah, go on.
Dilip makes a very important point. I mean, I think there is a lot of literature on gender and migration in general, but it often doesn't drill down into some of the specifics. And gender is a theme, a cross-cutting theme in the MIAG Hub, and we've just completed a household survey in 6 of the countries, so 3 corridors, so at both end of the corridor again, with very much a gender focus in terms of some of the questions, and it's a sample of around 9,000, I think, altogether. So hopefully in the next sort of 3 to 6 months, Joseph and others are involved in that survey, and we'll start to have some findings coming out. It'll be very interesting to sort of do that correlation between some of those issues around not just remittance transfers, but other kinds of measures of what you might call gender equality and how they tie in or don't tie in with the migration experience. So hopefully we should have something on that quite soon.
Thanks, Heaven. So we have a question from George, who is a colleague of Joseph's at the University of Ghana. So I think it's slightly picking up on something Heaven said, but I think others may have thoughts. So apart from remittances, so we discussed earlier that remittances can either enhance or reduce inequalities. Are there other factors to rely on, especially in traditional migratory communities? So I guess the question is, if we have multiple flows, one of which is remittances, what other flows would enhance or reduce inequalities besides remittances? If George, if I've got that wrong, please text away and tell me that that's wrong.
The biggest issue that we're finding is in relation to the right or otherwise to move, and the right or otherwise to be in a particular place, particularly as it relates to employment. So, you know, when you talk about exploitation of people in labour markets in many different contexts, part of that exploitation comes from the fact that they're migrants, but part of it comes from the fact of their irregularity or uncertainty or the lack of longevity around that status. And so, you know, it seems to us that many of the inequalities that we're seeing are not intrinsic to migration, but a reflection of the policies that are put in place to manage it, or the absence of those policies, when I'm talking, for example, about the lack of status and the lack of rights that migrants have in many contexts. And a lot of the work that's been done around kind of access to justice and rights for migrants is rightly oriented towards the employment sphere, but that's hardly the only one that matters. In fact, for many of the people that we speak to, you know, notions of justice and injustice are very, I mean, obviously work and money is important, but for many people that is the primary motivation. But they also have aspirations in relation to education for themselves and their children, access to healthcare. You know, there are multiple other ways in which people feel they have injustices in the migratory experience. And so I think, yeah, the inequalities that we're seeing stem partly from other inequalities that are exacerbated or reinforced, as I said earlier, but also these other layers of inequalities that are imposed by either the state or by the way that capitalist enterprises are basically allowed to sort of, you know, do what they will with labor because they have, you know, in many contexts, many privileges in terms of their rights and their opportunities. So I think it's really important not to see the inequalities being sort of associated per se with migration itself, but rather to see that the response to migration can create or indeed significantly worsen those inequalities for people where there might otherwise be opportunities. So I suppose MIAG is really about sort of trying to turn that around and turn those you know, those issues that can reinforce inequalities into something that potentially harnesses the benefits of migration, which Dilip and others have been talking about.
Thanks. Go ahead, Oliver.
I wonder if Giles, I mean, when George is talking about traditionally migratory communities, is that referring to sort of pastoralists and these sorts of people on the move, or I don't know if you have a sense of that, but maybe he will clarify.
Yeah, George, if you could, if you're still there, could you, because I guess it could be, yeah, it could be things like pastoralists, but I guess it could also be from areas, you know, where international migration, where there's bigger source areas that, you know, parts of China, you know, are more migratory into Africa or Europe than other parts. I've got two more. One's a biggie question, which I'm going to end on, I think, from Lola in Nigeria, but Inesh, who is a colleague on MIAG, and I think many of you know her as well from other incarnations of programs and projects. She asks about gender and poverty reduction and saying that women contribute especially to poverty reduction in their role as cross-border traders. The question, I guess, to, I mean, given that, Oliver, do you want to say, have you got anything to say on that in terms of gender and cross-border trade, or it's open to everybody, but I'm aware that...
I'd be wary of that as a generalization.
All right.
But I think in many contexts, you will find there's a huge amount of cross-border trade and women are very involved in that. And it will vary enormously depending on where you're talking about. But I think cross-border trade is really, really important. One of the casualties, if you like, of the way that we are talking about migration is so often it comes into discussion about borders and about how we manage what goes on at borders. And I'm thinking of the cross-border movements I've seen on Zambia, Angola, where women are very, very much involved, but also in between Sudan and Ethiopia, where the day-to-day crossings are vitally important for people's livelihoods. They're sanctioned and enabled by the border officials who are there, but there's no paperwork necessarily, or it's completely informally done, but it's recognized and accepted. And I think that's one of the dangers, trying to work out how those sorts of informal institutions can be of cross-border trade, can be sustained in the face of this concern about regularizing, controlling, taking the fingerprints and all that stuff of the well-managed border. I think it has huge implications, and it will have huge implications for these sort of different gendered ways people are using the border. I mean, just one other comment I'd have is we've talking a lot about inequality and concern. It's always about reducing inequality. I think we do also have to recognize there's potentially at times a productive value to inequality, because when you've got someone who sees someone crosses the border, they go over and do some trade and they come back with a good deal, they're better off. And that incentivizes people to do other things. And I think we do have to recognize that inequality, it to some extent does perform a function in terms of changing the way people do things. And I think, you know, the idea that everything is completely equal and we don't allow any inequality, and we crush it as soon as we see it, is going to be problem. There's a balance. We're way off the wrong side of that balance. But I do think we need to be a bit cautious about saying just because people move and that creates any inequality, it's necessarily problematic. I want to say something about the degrowth. I was just Parvati's question. And I just can't.
Yeah.
I haven't got an answer, but it really struck me that if we're talking about degrowth, we perhaps should be talking about exclusive degrowth. If we're going to have inclusive growth, we need the degrowth to be exclusive and exclusively targeted towards those who are at the top of the pile. So it needs to be turned around, perhaps. But it does need to happen.
But I think the other thing that's very interesting and worrying and not new, of course, in the context of the climate change debate is how migration has become the problem again. You know, there's a million other problems associated with climate change, but let's all focus on migration and the fact that everyone's therefore going to move to the global north and potentially undermine our already inflated sense of privilege. So, I mean, I think the problem with a lot of these things, as I say, is a sort of touchstone issue. It's much easier to talk about migration as the problem than overconsumption in the global north, for example. And that's, you know, yet again, and it often is wrapped up into the, as Dilip says, the root causes discussion, which has, you know, once upon a time I might have used myself, but certainly wouldn't use now because it seems to have become oriented towards sort of preventative measures rather than solutions. But yeah, I think that there is the climate change debate is very skewed when it comes to migration because it's always a problematized thing, like many other things in migration, I guess. So it's a good question or point.
Conscious of time, we're getting a few kind of sort of comments as much as we are questions. So George from Ghana did clarify he meant communities where migration has been the only option for survival and nothing else when he meant traditionally. We've got a question from Frederick. I guess not unconnected. I mean, it may be a bit of a stretch, but Lola at 1552 asked a question, I guess somewhat kind of a bit doom and gloom in the sense of everybody saying, well, you know, nation states don't have, you know, kind of create a problem as much as they solve it. You know, the big issues are a kind of more global level than necessarily the bottom up level. I think her frustration is, well, okay, so what can we tell policymakers? So she says, are there ideas about how to improve the application of this evidence to policymakers? Frederick's asking a more pointed question about if illegal migration is on the increase, how can developed nations assist developing countries to minimize illegal migration? So given it's 4:02, I'm going to throw the last round of question open to sort of what can we do if we had a magic wand, I guess, or a realpolitik wand, what's feasible and what's desirable, and we'll end it on there. Otherwise, I think we'll crash the system or something horrible. So I'm going to turn to.
The last question is an easy one. Basically, you need to create more, what you might call safe and legal pathways to migration. People become illegal because there are no other opportunities to move. It's very straightforward, and the demand, because of reasons of demographic change and otherwise, is very high for that movement to happen, including to Europe. So, straightforward answer. Whether they'll do it is another matter, of course. But and that's generally the problem. I suppose to come back to the other question is, the problem is not that there's a lack of evidence of any of this. I mean, we all know, and most people working in this area know, there's plenty of evidence about what could be done differently. It's really about the political will to do it. And I mean, I've personally, after sort of 30 years of this, come to the conclusion that as much as anything, we need to get that evidence to different people, not to politicians and policymakers, but to, groups of interested parties who have potentially not had nothing to do with migration in the past, but are interested in issues of social justice and injustice, and can mobilize around some of these issues, not in a way that focuses on migration, but focuses on inequality and in social injustice for large numbers of people who are being marginalized, including, but not exclusively, migrants. So I think mobilizing from the bottom up right now is probably the best way that we can try to do that, and by getting our evidence to those people and engaging them in that process, really.
Thank you, Heaven. So any that's a start for 10, as we say in, I don't know which show that is. Okay. Dilip, do you want to have your final thoughts on broadly on Lola's question of, okay, it all sounds a bit doom and gloom. Is there things we can actually do practically, politically?
Yep, couple of thoughts. First, that observation about that Oli made about Angola, Mozambique, or Sudan, Ethiopia. All over the world, there are border economies, even between India and China, and perhaps even India and Pakistan. I am from India, but I don't know that very well. But I believe that it is there, that, for a certain distance from the border on both sides, the communities are reasonably integrated, and they go back and forth, and, and I think we could benefit a lot by studying how people maintain their identity, national identity, while living in those communities, right? And I think that would shed a light on the whole question of identity and the nation state, and it hasn't been done properly. So a worldwide study of border economies and where they work, how they work, and what are the lessons for the rest of the world would be very, very useful in managing migration. And in terms of promoting safe and regular migration, there are interpretation of promoting safe and regular channels of migration. Of course, that's the best thing, right? But then there is a problem about what do you do when there are not enough safe and regular channels available, the number of visas available, and how do you then stop the people coming through the irregular channels, right? And they're escaping poverty and maybe with their family. So I think we have a problem that the problem of that the regular channels and safe channels are just not available enough, and we need to increase that. But I don't think we will still be able to increase that enough and not lose national identity. So we back to the same thing. And on that one, on a bottoms-up approach, one good thing is that in the Sustainable Development Goals, in that promoting safe and regular labor migration thing, 10.7, there is an indicator to reduce recruitment costs paid by workers. And that's a very tangible indicator. And by the way, in channels where number of visas are available, but they're not adequate, but legal channels are there, people, migrants, pay a huge amount of fees to labor agents, often in the range of 3 years of expected salary, right? That's what they pay upfront. to migrate, and there is, all of that is illegal. So something to do to reduce recruitment costs is a very tangible thing to do. And the final point I want to make is that migration challenge to me is increasingly, in my mind, a challenge for the host communities. And when there is a larger than expected increase in migratory flows to a community or a country, that is a global public bad. And that community or that country needs global support. And there are not enough resources, and there are no clear formal mechanisms to support such countries. So I would strongly support the idea of a concessional financing facility for migration to help such communities. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dilip. There's a fascinating documentary in your question about how do people maintain national identity. There's a strange game that people play in some places of the world called cricket, and we had a politician called Norman Tebbit who talked about the cricket test, that if you didn't support England, then you weren't a proper patriot of Britain. And there's a really nice documentary about how people in Britain of Asian origin, South Asian origin, support India, even though they've lived in Britain for second or third generation. And it was a really lovely exploration of how you can have very, very kind of mixed multiple identities, and it's not really a problem unless you're Norman Tebbit. But the final point, final response to Oliver, and then I'll wrap things up.
Yeah. I mean, I agree completely with Heaven's sort of slightly depressing take that we've got a lot of evidence, and actually getting that evidence into policy it's not really working. I'm not sure that we're ever going to get very far with that. Certainly when it comes to migration policy, and maybe it's a bit of a high risk strategy, but it's also really important to my mind, is if we understand more about the underlying process of mobility, maybe we don't focus so much on migration. In analysis, we talk about people moving, how people move, these day-to-day border crossings and things, as Dilip was saying, understanding the process of mobility and how that intersects with the way societies and politics and economies change, and bring that into policymakers. So when you're talking about urban planners, I mean, what is it about, how will they see people? How do they anticipate and deal with people coming and going? I'm sure they're already thinking of that, but it's recognizing this is the lifeblood of your city. This is the lifeblood of the economy. These things are fundamental to. The more we can bring it into a discussion of wider aspects of policy, with people who aren't obsessed with national borders and security and focusing on migration, maybe we then start to get a much better and deeper understanding of how this affects the way society, and we can start to see more equal outcomes and possibilities. So yeah, that's, but it's dangerous in some ways at the moment because things are so fevered that raising the profile, talking about these things in the wrong context. Oh no, if we think about doing this development, it might change people's mobility. Therefore, we don't invest, we don't train people, we don't educate, because if they get more education, they may want to move more.
Yeah.
Obviously, we don't want to go down that line, but education will have an effect on mobility, and we need to understand those linkages more. And yeah, they can be very productive.
Thank you. I guess you're on your final penultimate point, really. The COVID crisis in the UK highlighted that our health system does not function without migrants, and yeah, I think there was a realization there that migration may not be the problem, but whether that leads to any change, we don't know. Well, can I just formally thank everybody? That's been a wonderful hour and a half, or a little bit over now. I guess everybody needs a cup of tea, drink of water. But thanks to the speakers, Dilip, Oliver and Heaven. I wanted to thank Heidi, who has been shepherding us through the wonders of technology, Flavia and Wagner for, I can't hear it, because I don't speak Portuguese anyway, and I hope I didn't speak too quickly for them, but thanks to them for the translation, to Craig as well for supporting everything. As I said, this is the first of 3. So tomorrow at 12:30, we have this GMT now. We're back to GMT, away from summertime. So I don't know what that means for anybody else, but that's 12:30 tomorrow. We're digging into the question of diaspora and entrepreneurship. So we have colleagues from Afford and elsewhere. And then coming back to the questions we've just been finishing around, Joseph Tay, who is known to many of you, is going to be chairing the 3rd webinar on Wednesday, the 10th at 12:30 GMT on migration governance. So please, if you've enjoyed this, found it provoking, tell your friends, family, loved ones, colleagues to come and join those. We'd love to have you along. Just so, thank you very much. And I'm not going to touch anything in case I turn something off that I'm not supposed to, but thanks everybody, and
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Evan. Thanks, Dilip. Thanks, Oliver.